Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome, welcome. We're going to begin this morning with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the unnamed and named artist who accumulated knowledge our research and textiles draws from. We commit to respecting and learning from these enduring traditions as we acknowledge the history and presence of Indigenous peoples in the Colorado Front Range. We recognize that we occupy the traditional and ancestral lands of the Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne peoples, whose rich cultural heritage and legacy continue to shape this region. We honor their deep-rooted traditions, including their skilled textile practices, which embody stories, spiritual beliefs, and communal knowledge passed down through generations. These Indigenous communities' intricate beadwork, weaving, and garment making reflect a proud connection to the land and their resilience as artisans and storytellers. Thank you so much for joining us here this morning. We would love to start off this morning by seeing where everybody is from. So please open up your chat window. Please say hi, tell us where you're coming from. And I am going to also turn on audio captions for everybody now so that you can see if you would like. Also, if you would like to, you can turn on audio captions in your own Zoom feature. Those should be available. All right. Welcome, 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 folks. We're so excited to have Ricki here this morning. As you're in here today, how we're going to run everything. As Ricki's speaking, go ahead and drop your questions in the chat as you see them. And what we'll do is after Ricki's done speaking, I will help facilitate a little bit of a Q&A. And you know that we announced earlier that today's talk was not going to be recorded, but at the request of the artist, we are going to record it this morning. So please, thank you so much for joining us live, regardless. And this will be available on YouTube later in the week. Laura, will you start us off with some announcements this morning?
Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen, and thank you so much, Etta, for your support in setting up this series, and of course to Ricki for joining us today and sharing your practice. So welcome to the Experimental Weaving Talk Series. You are attending the third in our series of, I believe it's 8 total talks. So we'll have talks coming up later in February, March, and April, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for those as well. Okay, so these talks are hosted by the Unstable Design Lab, where we get a kick about wearing matching outfits with a ColourPop sock, which we are highlighting in this photo that we've chosen to show the world that, you know, maybe makes me reflect on our choices, but I enjoy it. So yeah, the Unstable Design Lab is a research lab at the University of Colorado Boulder. We run a number of programs that are thinking about the role of craft and the legacies of craft and how they help us rethink innovation or engineering practices. One of the main projects that we've been working on quite seriously for the past few years, and we'll have a big update coming soon, is called AdaCAD. AdaCAD is an open source software that runs online, it's free to use, and it follows a parametric design approach where you basically like write code, though all those bits of codes are elements of weaving drafts. So if you're interested in that, feel free to check it out. Also want to promote our archive. We have kept recordings of each experimental weaving talk series. We've heard really lovely feedback from the community who watch these just for their own enjoyment, share them with their class, maybe even share them at a weaving guild meeting. And it's become a really powerful and I think important collection of voices and practices. So I encourage you to check this out if you're interested. And again, Ricki's talk will join this archive after today. So without further ado, I'm so happy to introduce Ricki Dwyer today. Ricki's practice really stood out to us because of its thoughtfulness, both in the weaving structure and form, but Ricki approaches the installation also very holistically, so handcrafting the mounts to the walls. And something about that integration and the way they're using weaving, or the way he's using weaving, is just really powerful. And I think I'm just so excited to hear more. So Ricki, would you go ahead and take it away? Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Laura and Etta and Stephen. It's really an honor to be here and to be among all of these voices that you've curated. Such a fantastic program you guys are organizing. Pleasure to be in this space. I'm going to share my screen. Is that working? Great. So I framed this talk around the topic of experimental weaving to the best of my abilities. But while I was reflecting on that topic, I realized that I do kind of consider myself a weaver by happenstance. More so, it just happens to be the tool I use as a sculptor and an artist. So while some of the other talks in the series are so elegantly focused on specifically how and why weaving is happening within their studio, a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about are more just how and why my practice happens and why it happens to be weaving at the moment. And the moment has been 10 years and will probably be the entirety of my life, but it still feels as though it happens to be weaving as the output for holding a lot of the ideas that I have within my artistic practice. But the other thing that came up when considering experimentation within weaving was the idea of experimentation. I had to reflect quite a bit on if I thought my practice was really experimental, and then what the word experimental meant to me. And even in listening to Etta's really gorgeous talk that they gave last year in this series, and kind of breaking down some of the definition of what experimental meant to them in terms of, something that happens in a space of the unknown, something that is really hinged on failure. Both of those things felt really exciting to me in the relationship to how queerness is discussed. And then also just this idea of hinging experimentation to queerness as this, kind of ideology of a lot of queer people are just experimenting, or a straight person might be momentarily in a queer experience as an experimental operation for them. So hinging both experimentation as something that's diminished the way that queerness is often diminished, to me links those two things in a conceptual notion of like exterior or less than or temporary or outside of some kind of norm, or therefore diminished in this way. And I think there's a lot of potency in considering that, and then considering what those links can really do. And in that framework, I consider, I guess, all of my work to be really experimental, not in that I work through any kind of small um, tests. I almost never do any tests for any of my projects, but that in and of itself is that my pieces are the experiment. And so everything that I'm showing is sitting in this space of unknowing, and once something feels really resolved, I'm kind of moving past it. So to that end, I framed the talk that I'm going to go through a lot of my work around questions that I asked my friends and community to send my way yesterday when I was figuring out how to put together a talk on experimental weaving. And the thing that really came to mind was how much I really don't love giving artist talks and kind of speaking into this void and projecting and announcing myself in this way. But what does feel really great to me is talking to my friends and my community about what is happening in my studio and my practice and what they're excited about and what's happening for them. So to that end, I, reached out to some beloveds, and they sent back questions they had for me about my practice, and I'm going to go through those, starting with my amazing sister, who is also a fantastic artist. This is one of the questions she sent for me. Um, and this idea as a framework for the talk really hits home one of my favorite quotes that I actually can't place. And if anyone in the audience knows who said this and when, I would love to hear it, because I've been asking around for years and I wish I remembered the citation for this. But the idea that we should all be putting our friends in our art all the time, just as a record that we were here and that we existed. Um, and so this is to honor that notion. But my sister wrote back to me and she asked, where do my ideas come from? And the thing that really stuck out for me in that I was that I don't think they are mine. Like I feel very little ownership around any of the ideas in my practice, so much as I think we're all kind of honing in on like a melting pot of ideas together in this tapping into some kind of source. Um, but I do think if I had to break down where the ideas that I don't really have ownership for do come from. It would be experimentation, um, existing in the world, talking to friends, reading texts, and then also applications. But to the end of experimentation, a lot of what I have been excited about lately is the dye process that I first saw from like stains, the way that some of the synthetic colors that we're using as textile makers, um, not working with botanical dyes, hold many different dye particles within them. And so some of those tests have become my recent work, but they are these chromatograms that separate those moments of dye particles within a single color that you source as a synthetic dye. And so I first noticed this accidentally when, spilling dye or allowing it to run on its own, but then operating in that way where I'm allowing the dye to get sucked up into the fabric itself creates these chromatograms in which the color within the dye work gets separated. So that's coming from an experimental place for me um, that then becomes kind of this like formal signifier in my work. And then speaking to how kind of my lived experience or the environment around me really plays into it, this was a residency in Lithuania. I was taking some of the work that I was doing out into the snow to photograph it. And one of the first things I noticed was that the warp threads disappeared on the snow. And that just became so generative for me in the ways that, a lot of things disappear against the white wall of the gallery and what becomes normalized when it is this like stark white on white, and how that can relate to the ways that populations exist in space and normalcy and a material relationship to a sense of embodiment and moving through the world. And then speaking to how applications feel really generative to me, just the idea of needing to think through and produce work for a certain space or a certain environment is something that I try to think of as a really generative practice. And it is often where my ideas come from, is being forced into the, uh, you know, framework of what they're asking for. How does my work fit that, and what can I create for that environment? Like pushes my brain through a set of constraints that become really generative. And here's another one that an application for like a massive installation ended up being something that I made a maquette for, and then that maquette ended up being one of my most significant pieces last year for me. And my sister also asked why weaving, which I do get a lot. And my answer is often like, oh, it was an accident. The, university I went to didn't have a sculpture department, so I ended up taking, a lot of textiles classes and working in soft sculpture. But ultimately, it was the loom. I kind of like got forced into taking a weaving class to get a degree, and then the machine itself was so exciting for me and really drew all of my attention. And this is a piece I made, the first time that I made my own loom on a massive scale. And it was a way to facilitate, a class structure. Was in North Carolina and Asheville, and I'll talk about this piece a bit later if I get there. But also weaving is something that produces a materiality that holds so many concepts for me. The idea of cloth is really a material of desire, and it holds so many different intersections of interest. And these were the first pieces that I made on the loom that became something I was interested in discussing. Previous to these, I think they were 2017. I was working on the loom because it was something my body really enjoyed and my head really enjoyed. And I wasn't necessarily producing woven work that was something I wanted to show in my art practice or talk about with an audience, but these were the first time that really came together. And it was the moment that it was really coming off the wall and being draped over these plinths that I had fabricated as a way to form this relationship to a body or to embodiment and to something really gestural and a posed figure. And then the really momentary gesture of drapery became something that really unlocked the idea of installation in my brain, and the idea of cloth as drapery rather than as, a flat flannel or only a surface. My friend Jason's asking, do you have a favorite work you've ever made? If so, if you can't decide, what elements are you most drawn to within your own pieces? What brings you the most joy to create? And I think for me, the joy really comes from an interaction with the material revealing something to me. I work in a way that I might call intuitive. Um, but that's just kind of a placeholder for the idea that I'm making formal decisions about a lot of different threads of thought within my mind that I have to work through the practice often to then reflect on what it was I was really asking the work to hold. Um, so for instance, I made this piece for a gallery, and it's difficult to see in the top image, but in the bottom, you can see the same work installed and how it had been woven to map to those panels of the original window. So they were imprinted in the cloth to the exact dimension of that original window of the original installation. But then when it was reinstalled in a different gallery on another window, that representation revealed the original imprint so much more drastically against that wall, and also, gave a way for the work to represent in a totally new configuration that holds very different meaning and a misalignment, and that misalignment is so exciting for me and so much of what this piece for me is now about. Um, and so these kind of moments in which like I'm uncertain about what it is that I'm doing, and I am in this place of the unknown, and I'm following formal considerations, but knowing that the decisions that I'm making are holding a lot of concepts for me that then I can untangle later and find a way to speak about. Here's another example of when I was, weaving some of this very traditional overshot woven structures that are really linked to, a colonial aesthetic from the early American colonies of weaving these coverlets. And then I threw in this like graffiti moniker, and the duality felt formally significant for me at the time. And then in reflection, it really became this place in which I was understanding that I was working through both of these like very gendered signifiers of, street art culture, as well as uh, a traditional textile field. And those were two worlds of art that I was trained within or came up through, both, with friends on the street doing graffiti, and then also in my formal training. And what does it mean as a person like living within those two intersections? And then also I named this piece, I never got to be a dyke, but I know I'll get to be a fag, just with this idea of how does my presentation get read by the world and what ownership do I have over that? So linking these two aesthetics then with this kind of poetic language housed for me this question that I was thinking through at the time in terms of how much ownership do I have over my identity? What relationship does the way that I self-identify have to do with how people read me? And how do those things come together as I move through the world and exist and shift? And then just another example of the way that some of these things reveal themselves as I'm working with the piece. I wove this work and installed it, but I didn't have hardware to hang it in the corner, and I knew it needed to go in the corner, and I knew the cloth needed to be in this configuration. But I had a brilliant friend, Hannah Patterson, say, "Oh, well, it's circular, but it's also steps. Have you thought about the hero's journey?" And that really unlocked for me. It's the notion of, I think it's Joseph Campbell wrote this text, and Star Wars is based off of it. Even Harry Potter is based off of it. Like this idea of like a singular mythology of like the really special boy going through this hero's journey was this archetype written, really pulling from Carl Jung. Anyway, to me, it feels like a very problematic text that a lot of like masculine individualism within this country is founded on, as this kind of ideal of a perfect story or a narrative that upholds this like special boy going through a journey. And so the tags then were stamped with these steps in the hero's journey to create this caricature of this piece as a um, holding some of that for me as I was thinking through these ideas. Some of the steps that I used were call to adventure, road of trials, the ultimate boon, atonement with the Father, and then freedom to live. And I did try and choose some of the ones that felt more problematic. Jason also asked, how do your interests outside of the studio influence your work? And I did have a hard time thinking through this because I am somebody who doesn't necessarily feel like I know how to differentiate what is inside and outside of my studio. The piece I chose is called Solid Evening Look. And for me, I think the language around that title holds a lot of social connotation for me. Like the idea of like looking solid, looking good is kind of a slang word. But then I'm like, well, is it? Doesn't everyone know what that means? So I couldn't actually contextualize whether or not that was or was not legible. But the idea of a solid evening look, and then this piece is a block of ice that's melting and the cloth has been frozen within it and it's melting back into the vitrine that it was frozen in, um, is something in which when you approach it in the gallery, we're all very aware of the idea that ice melts. We have an understanding of that materiality, of that, property of material and physics, but we can't actually see it. It's melting so slowly that our eye can't perceive it. It's just this like sense of knowing that we have for how the world works. And then that can, of course, ideally allow us to self-reflect on the way that our own bodies are growing and changing at absolutely every moment. Our taste buds are changing, our emotions are changing, our skin cells are dying and regenerating. And so that kind of like reflective notion of how this piece can hold that concept that allows us to consider our own embodiment and that kind of malleable fluctuation. Um, all that's to say, I think a lot of my pieces help me think through the way that I'm situated in the world and how I exist and how I comprehend the world around me. So I don't have a whole sense of when I'm not thinking about that as a person and like the edges of my studio and my thought process. Um, Marcella asks, how do you think contemporary queer life factors into craft mediums and theories? And I think this is a gorgeous question, and there's too much to say in the time frame. Um, I just chose this one piece to sit here while I talked for a second, but I think Julia Bryan Wilson does a really beautiful job of discussing this. I went to UC Berkeley specifically to work with her as well as Stephanie Sayugo, but Julia Bryan Wilson talks in Fray, in particular, a book she published, I think in 2019, 2018, about the link between textiles and queerness. And then Glenn Adamson talks more broadly about craft and queerness. Again, is this idea of craft as something that's diminished to art, and therefore there's something that can be really juicy or generative or powerful about the idea of like transgressing those boundaries, but also of what you can do from this like underbelly, or from a place of being um, cast out from a canon, um, the power within the kind of disenfranchisement. But then Julia Bryan Wilson also brings in the concept of, well, textiles are a world building practice. It's a way of self-fashioning. If you don't have your own clothing, you make your own clothing. If you don't have your own tools, you make your own tools. And so craft from that lens then becoming something that is inherently linked to queerness as like, oh, well, the world's not made for us. We have to make clothing for ourselves. We have to make tools for ourselves. We have to make a world that reflects us. And that practice as specifically linked with people who don't see themselves reflected and then producing that self-reflection and constructing the world they want to live in, I think houses craft and specifically textiles in this inherently queer space. And this piece is called The Conditions of Consciousness Formation, which I pulled as a title from David Harvey's Conditions of Postmodernity. Um, but for me, it is really housed in the way that Jose Esteban Munoz talks about the horizon line as something of a queer futurity that is always moving. As you move towards the horizon, it moves farther away from you. So queerness is being this place in which is an ever moving future as we move towards it, and something to reach for. And so for me, holding those two notions of, this post-structuralist and this queer Marxist together, and thinking through the way that my brain holds some of these things. I have this double weave structure here, folding through some of those things, but then resting on this horizon line as the anchor that allows some of these things to take shape. So in a lot of ways, I do think of queerness as something that is this harnessing through line through a lot of the work that I think through and a lot of the ways that I exist in the world. They're also asking, in your making process, how do you allow for long, meditative, repetitive work to coexist with the risk of experimentation? And again, I think the first reaction I had to this was a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of a meditative, repetitive process. I think because I do have a meditation practice, the idea that people are constantly coming to loom work and weaving as like, oh, well, that must be meditative is really frustrating to me because I specifically use it as a disassociative practice. I think that meditation for me is something that really brings focus inward and makes me very aware and hypersensitive to my corporeal self and the way that I'm sitting in the world and the way that my body exists and the moment in space and time that I'm in. And loom work does absolutely the opposite, or a lot of the repetitive tasks that I do are really the opposite of that in terms of they allow me to disassociate and disappear and be somewhere else and step outside of like a lot of body pain I have from this work. But back to the question of like, how do I let some of that really repetitive labor coexist with my desire for experimentation? And I thought of this piece, which was in the most recent show I had in November at a gallery in Chicago called Volume. The image is taken from David Vornerovich, who produced these as stencils in the late 70s and early 80s. And I'll talk more about the meaning of that kind of imagery later if I'm able to get through all of these slides. Um, but I wove the canvas and I inlaid this image as I went, and it was a very laborious task. And I ended up making all three so that you could see a repetition of that imagery as if it could expand into a larger field. Um, but when I first laid it out and then I wove it, it was too abstract. And so even going through these three, I said, well, I clearly have to remake it. And then I ended up making it twice more because the first time that I dyed it, it wasn't giving an energy that I felt appropriate to the work. So the first time I dyed it was what I was used to, allowing the cloth to kind of suck the dye upward and give this chromatogram of separated colors. And then the second time I dyed it flat to allow the dye to move a little bit differently. And just here's another image of that laying on my table. Um, and so I guess to answer Marcella's question of like, how do I let some of that labor sit alongside experimentation? I do consider all my pieces to be very experimental and a relationship of play between what the material wants and what I want and that constant negotiation. But inevitably, if it doesn't feel right, I will just remake it, and I have no um, shame or frustration in that. I think that process of really being in relationship with the materials and with the piece and knowing what they want and being able to identify that and allow that to happen is something that I take a lot of pleasure in, even if it means reproducing the same work 3 times to get to the goal that I'm looking for, or that we're looking for in relationship, I suppose, me and the piece together. Lucchesa then asks, how and when do you decide on the size of your piece? There are moments when the work is quite small, and there are works that are the size of buildings and the size of the room and feels expansive. Where and how does the size of the woven work get decided, and what is the relation between that and the content of the work? And the first thing that came to mind when Lucchesa was talking about a piece the size of a building or a room was this work, and I love this image, and I've never gotten to show it, but that's my friend Callan standing with this piece that I wove that was I think it was like 45 inches wide on the loom, but then 5 layers. So when it came off, it was one woven cloth that could have laid on the gallery floor that it hung above. It was mapped to that dimension to kind of hold that space within it as it moved forward into another installation. But here it's installed with 6 cast brass fixtures are what attach it to the architecture. And in working on this scale, I think one of the things that I'm thinking of all the time is the relationship between monumental and intimate. And that's something that Robert Morris wrote about in his like early 70s texts, notes on sculpture, but that if something's bigger than your body, it feels monumental. And if something's smaller than your body, it feels intimate. So I do think a lot about how my work is experienced in the space, and then what relationship and what emotion it will evoke, if it will make me feel small because of its scale, or if it will make my body feel large because of its scale, and when I want to evoke intimacy. And ultimately, I think that the dissonance between scale when I present is to evoke a sense of yeah, closeness and intimacy. Like this work in general was so that I could then have, this is the installation drawing, this moment here. um, I think that's kind of what I was most excited about in that entire installation, was then arriving at those little moments when things are really held. I think of weaving so much as a process of joinery, of bringing things together, of bringing threads together, but then also how is the cloth installed in the space, and what's the relationship between cloth and architecture, and between my body and architecture in the space, and those moments when materials meet and what that meeting signifies, but also feels like. So here's another one where I made this somewhat massive cloth that was all woven simultaneously. I think it's 6 layers, and it unfolds into this space. But when I was thinking through this installation, what I was most excited about was this moment here. Um, these little cast brass kisses that I made to hold the work to the architectural space. And then these are some of my smaller works. And I think the feeling that I'm going for of this dissonance between scale is achieved with the room that it's in. So the architectural space does feel so massive in this kind of warehouse gallery. It's a Hausfeld gallery in San Francisco, that then the work itself can be approached with this real delicacy. And then it can hold its own in that way. Lakeza also asked, curious about the images you reference in your work and how you source that imagery. Does it come from time spent in archives or drawing? Curious how the depictions that are woven into this work get decided on. You do this magical way of really subverting the image while also making it so present. So it's a two-part question: where the imagery comes from and how it lands itself into the work, and then when the legibility feels important and when it feels it must be decoded. And if anyone in this room isn't familiar with Lucchese Branfman Verissimo's work, this question of legibility is really potent to what they're producing as well. They work with a lot of text in this really beautiful way that constantly questions legibility and the demand for it. So I'm honored that, you know, they're asking my opinion on these questions as well, but it also makes sense. So here's another image from this show that I installed. The show is titled A Mobilizing Force, and it went up in November at Volume Gallery. And this was the first piece that came to mind when I was making this show. I've been thinking so much about David Lynch recently and the way he speaks about creativity and this idea of catching a big fish. And I guess this was like, you know, the first little fish that came up in the net when I started pulling on some of these threads of ideas that I was thinking through for the show, and things kind of fell in line behind it. And I didn't necessarily know at the time what, you know, was going to be in the whole net as I pulled it up, but this was like the first real link in the chain. This idea of the imperial boomerang as something that we are all experiencing in this country at the moment. It's you know, critical anti-colonialist theory that was first presented by Amy Césaire, and then Hannah Arendt wrote on it heavily, and then Foucault really popularized it in the 70s. But this idea that an imperialist country will inevitably deploy the forces of violence and oppression that it uses abroad at home, as we see this rise of fascism and this rise of militarization and violence in this country. I think this concept is something that was really potent for me at the time when I was thinking through this show. So how to then bring that into the work, and how do I want to make it legible, is yes, I did, but also the notion that these 3 panels needed to be in a group for that to be read. Really, I planned it out so that the text spread across the panels in a way where a singular one couldn't be decoded or couldn't be legible, but in a mass, in community, in multiples, there was something that happened in which there was more power there, and there was more way for that to be readable. And I think that hinges on the way that I consider weaving to be, in many ways, this, I mean, used historically as a notion to like decode social gathering, but also at this moment, a notion of like the potency of mutual aid in terms of like many individual threads becoming a stronger whole, or rather collective action might be a better notion there. But these panels that I made are you know, swatches in some sense of a repeat pattern. And then when you have all three, you can see how the pattern is repeating and can kind of connect infinitely, as if there are so many more of these that could exist in the world. Yeah, and that they are not alone. And then the next work that came was this series of three that's also a repeat pattern. It takes much more focus to decode that repeat, which is fine for me. I don't think the notion that this pattern is repeating is like at the forefront of what these works are doing for me, but this imagery comes um, in response to the Imperial Boomerang. I started thinking about the room that the gallery was in as this white box. It was like really a rigid square as kind of a ritual space. And I allowed the Imperial Boomerang to hold the notion of like the earth at this moment. And then I started thinking really about elemental magic. So we went into planning the other three series that I wanted in the space to reflect that. So I have one holding a sense of water, and one holding a sense of fire, and one holding a sense of air, as a way to also think about forces that can deteriorate the social fabric, forces of nature that are larger than the human structure. So this is holding a sense of water, and that came from ink drops, which then I translated into the cartoon and then wove that as the inlaid image before they were dyed. And then this one is holding this place of air, and how I worked through that imagery was to study the way a lot of like rips or tears get made in cloth if it's left outside. So I left some of these sections unwoven as a way to talk about how air can deteriorate fabric in relationship to the social fabric. And then again, this is David Vornarovich's imagery that I pulled for this series to hold a place of fire. And his work was speaking specifically to the violence that the queer community was facing from the government at the time in the early 80s, with such negligence around the AIDS crisis. The fire was coming from inside the house, and this image feels as potent now as it did then. Lack of support for marginalized communities in this country, allowing so much violence to increase, and just disinterest in caring for our humanity and our safety in our lives. And this is his original stencil. Liz Roberts asks, okay, get through maybe two more questions. I'm seeing the time is already 11:40. What is your process for getting the emotion of the idea you had into the work, and how does this feeling reside in the materials? I think this is a great question. I don't have an answer for that. I think so much of what I want is these little moments of tension or pressure, intimacy. This piece, my favorite little moment is just that little bit at the top. This is the work here. But I think so much of my work is done in relationship with the materials in this terms of experimentation. I'm working from a place of unknown, either this idea of moving from a formal consideration, okay, here's four different ways that these two warps can interact. How can they really hold totally different character and hold totally different emotional palettes, but come off of the same warp together? You know, you can view them as siblings cut from the same cloth, or different facets of like one emotional swing, or different aspects of one person's personality. But it's two warps intersecting in a variety of ways to hold a totally different emotional potency was the goal that I went into with this series. And then it became a push and a pull with each and every one of, okay, well, now that I made the cloth, what's it really doing? What does it really want? Is this working? Is this working? So this is an image of the work on the loom as I was weaving that structure. But then a lot of my practice looks like this, of like, ooh, does it get installed this way? Does it get installed this way? And this provisional hardware as I work through very formal considerations that end up really holding conceptual potency as I untangle where those choices were coming from an embodied perspective. So this was an absolute failure, but I was like, oh, does it exist this way? And then this started to feel right as it hung on the wall, and then inevitably a cast bat was added, and it became so clearly for me this way to acknowledge the different emotional and embodied senses of knowing that we have, as akin to the way that a bat can echolocate its own environment. We have ways of responding to the environment around us that don't come from an intellectual sense, but come from a place of what our body needs and how our body responds and how it feels in a space. There's a lot of information there. Um, I spend a lot of time with somatic practices, and I'm so grateful for a rise of this dialogue to be happening in the world, but allowing my practice to be something that hones a sense of trust that I have for my body to be making some of these decisions, to have it coming from a very informed place, even if I can't name that logic in the moment of making that decision. Um, and then something I didn't speak to yet, and I might not have time, but the relationship between text and textiles, and how I'm considering some of these new works that I'm stretching as paintings, but also as like a page. And for the first time, allowing some of that imagery to really call attention to the surface rather than the form and the structure of the cloth as a more sculptural object, as something that is more in line with a lineage of thought around weaving as a record and weaving as a text, and these pages. And in that way, I allowed these sculptures to be, citations or footnotes for these more formal paintings on the wall for this last show. Um, I hated this question, and I loved that I hated this question. What's an area of your life work where you wish to be understood? And I think that for me, the idea of understanding feels really violent. I think there's so much pressure coming from a sense of control put around understanding. Um, if someone can understand you, they can own you and they can change you. And this sense of like so many people just wanting to understand transness or understand queerness, I really push back against, as a sense of like, well, what will that give you? Is there a space for you to allow it to exist if you cannot understand it? Like, what does not understanding offer you? Um, can that give you information on where this drive for you to understand is coming from? So this piece came to mind. I was working with the archive of a dyer in the Bay Area where I'm from. I was doing a fantastic residency at Recology, the San Francisco dump, and she had donated all of her dye lots, and I arranged them by color and ended up making this double weave in which the two panels intersected where those two gradients became the least saturated, as if they were closest to each other at that moment. But then, of course, the green and the pink really don't have much similarity, but that is the moment of most similarity within these two gradients of color. And that one moment of intersection being something that, you know, while it is their most similar moment, it is also so visually dissimilar. And so these moments of misrecognition or misalignment, I think, hold so much potency. Here's another one in which I played with this steel figure that I had cut, being inlaid into the cloth. So, it takes like a little bit of a second glance to realize that that imagery in the cloth isn't a shadow, although it's meant to look as if it's connecting this whole daisy chain or barbed wire hoop together. But it's like playing with this idea of legibility and registration, and asking you to not understand, and like what is the potency there, and like what new connections can be made with this lack of understanding, and how is questioning that generative. Jay is asking me about how autobiography meets with experimentation with my work. And some of my work is quite autobiographical, but at the same time, I think about it more as like I'm just a medium to hold some of these ideas. This is a horseshoe crab my mother gave me, and her name is Penelope, which is also the name of the, beautiful weaving wife in Odysseus's, or in the Odyssey, in Homer's Odyssey. And so it hinges me to this conversation. It does happen to be my mother's, but it's also, children of Penelope is another way to think through some of our lineage as weavers. Um, I'm going to jump through some of these slides. You've created pieces in the past through collaboration with nature. Would you do that again? In particular, I think what Bo was thinking about was a piece I made during COVID in which I was installing work outside. There's this piece and then this work in conjunction with Nikki Green. Both have bolts in them that were soaked in vinegar, and then the fog in the air, as this was in an area close to the coastal bay, allowed the work to rust. And I wish I had an after shot, but there was these beautiful dripping iron stains as the iron in the bolts eroded and then inevitably dyed the work. And for me, this was a relationship between um, the material and then also the time of COVID, trying to like mark time and understand the passage of time as we were stagnant in lockdown, and trying to remember that things were changing and passing and having a visual reminder of that. Nikki, I want to ask, I want to know how teaching and weaving intersect. You teach a lot of academic work these days, but you also have a history with experimental weaving as pedagogy. And that brings me back to this piece that I first made, which was a way to facilitate a class environment. How can I make something that is really legible, that a group can interact with, that then I can invisibilize myself? And this is how I think about academic settings too, like myself as facilitator rather than lecturer, rather than this top-down knowledge of giving students information. How can I set up an environment in which they can share and collaborate towards a goal together? So with this piece, my intention was that it was visually intuitive enough that people could approach it who had never woven and like understand how things operated and how things needed to go, but you needed 6 to 8 people to do it. So it was a matter of being like, well, if I pull this, I think it works this way, and you can beat it this way. And so my role as a facilitator and my sense of pedagogy is to kind of set things up that are ideally intuitive enough that a group can work through them together. And I think about that way in my seminar classes of how can I become as invisible as possible in a discussion about a text? How can I set up a project in which they can then work together to facilitate their own learning and their own goals? More images of this taken by Faith Levine, the fantastic documentarian. More dye work and allowing the material to perform alongside me and also ask what it wants of it. And then this is the last question that I'll end on from Kiwi Kajan Thomas. When looking at your work and reading some of the titles like Family Limits, The Political Imaginary, or I Never Got to Be a Dyke, but I Know I'll Get to Be a Fag, you lean into the poetics of queerness and, dare I say, abstraction. Do you think about the way you bridge mediums like weaving, textiles, metal hardware, color and drawing in space, etc., into the more sculptural compositions as a way to shed light on your own queer stories and imagined futures? How does poetry factor into the way you decide on what materials will best communicate your vision? Um, it's a beautiful question. And again, I think back to this notion of like working alongside experimentation, leaning into the unknown, trying to trust my body and trust that all of the things that I'm reading and thinking about, all of the friends I'm organizing with, how I'm working on the streets, how I'm in dialogue with people are coming into play in my studio, and trust that it will make itself known. And it is often in reflection. But this structure came out of an experiment in seeing if I can really display the ways in which so many layers work and operate. And for me, it became a real visual narrative of like non-linear time in a queer sense and a sense of queer becoming. It's not a single path the way that a lot of heteronormativity considers time is like, now you're this age and this happens, and now you're this age and this happens, and now you're this age and this happens. Um, it is this massive nonlinearity of diverging and expanding and coming back together, and that sense of embodiment being really present in this material structure. But then the installation work in particular coming together, when I cast these little bolts that I were dyeing with textile dye, and realizing the, you know, cross material knowledge share of a twisted thread to a threaded bolt. And I haven't found any research on like the relationship there of threads in metal to threads in string, though I have found some through agricultural uh, ways of moving water, which is another tangent. But yeah, allowing these bolts to hold some of that information, I think pushes this piece then into a sense of like, when is rigidity necessary, and what can the flexibility of twist really teach us in terms of how to hold tension in our bodies and how to hold tension in materiality, and the strength and the you know, the fragility of straightness, and then the power of twist and queerness to withstand so much more tension. And I think I have really spoken too long, so that's gonna be the end of my slides, but I would love to hear any questions coming from the audience, and thank you for listening.
This was so lovely, Ricki. Thank you. Maybe if folks are comfortable unmuting and clapping so that it's not the silent void, maybe drop something in the chat to let us know you're here, maybe what you responded to. This was so beautiful, and I love the place where you ended it, Ricki. And I have to confess, I took a screenshot because I think I really love that metaphor of the threaded bolt and the twist and the tension, but also the energy. And I think maybe we're all looking for something to make us feel a little less flattened these days. So, yeah, I will turn it over to Stephen for questions. I will say that in your bio, I was trying to get to words that I realized I wasn't getting to very well. But what I think I was trying to get at is something about this atmospheric quality to your work and these moments you talked about, these kind of punctuations with the hardware and the metalwork. And oops, let me mute that. I saw a few questions in the chat too, where I think a lot of us are really captivated by those moments where the textile and the metal intersect, and maybe you could just unpack those choices a little bit more.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it comes from, you know, how do I want the work to take shape? I think something that I love about textiles is that it's a material that's entirely reliant on its context and gravity, like its environment, to have form. Um, and so the fixtures that I'm making are a way for it to take space in that moment. And there's something so momentary about it that's really exciting for me in the process of working with cloth. It's like, well, it's draping like this right now, but who knows where it's going to be tomorrow. And so a lot of the fixtures that I'm making are, you know, ways to put it into that form momentarily. But then I never want to have it look fixed. So a lot of these moments of like tension and being grabbed are to move against this idea of, well, it's like sewn and stapled and finished and done. I'd rather it would look like pinned momentarily or like hanging on this hook, or held for a moment.
Thank you so much, Ricki. We like once again, I'll just echo everything Laura said. And I think I love that comment you made about not understanding as a space to like exist in, and also to like as a point of resistance. And I really appreciated that comment so much, and I'll carry that with me going forward. So thank you so much. I want to ask you a question again about your fixtures. And this is building kind of from our question Amanda Wood had, kind of two parts. One is, are you, the one kind of more technical question is, are you constructing these yourselves, or are you collaborating with a sculptor to create these, and what's the kind of technical process like? But then stepping back, I also want to know about, and I think you've kind of already answered this, the nails in the canvases, how they just they're so perfect at doing exactly what you were just saying, like resisting the permanence of the staple, and they also just have so much presence. So could you talk a little specifically about the nails and then a little about your process of constructing these metal pieces?
Yeah, great question. I do, at this moment, I'm fabricating everything myself. There's a few pieces which I have found objects in. If there's something I really love that I feel like can hold something poetic for me, I'll throw it in there. But I do a lot of casting in my studio, and then I also have done a lot of metal casting, both on residencies. I was able to do the Kohler residency, so I was casting brass, which is where a lot of these objects are coming from, as well as iron. And then I'm going to plug Acre residency, which I know Etta highly supports as well in Western Wisconsin. We're also, facilitating the emergence of a small foundry there. So I'm able to go on summer residencies and do these like aluminum pours. But for the most part, a lot of the plaster casting happens in my studio. I have facilities for that. And then the nails is directly taken actually as a visual reference to an artist named Miyoko Ito, who was a Chicago abstract painter. And I was just stunned when I saw her use of that from a sculptural perspective. I really work as somebody who's drawn to weaving because it, to me, is like a process of joinery. It's together.
I
I
just
think
wanted to,
that's how my brain works too. Like, what happens when I pull this thing and this thing together? What is it saying now? And like, how does it come together? And what's that fastening? And what's that fixture? So working in like paintings now, I didn't want to give that up. So it does implicate this sense of like sculptural objectness, but also the way Miyoko Ito used it. She claims that it was like so she could unstretch it at a moment's notice because her life was really transient. She was somebody who was Japanese American, had been interned, and I think that left a lot of imprint on how she moved through the world after. And I think that lends itself a lot conceptually to the way my sculptures operate, and something that like promises this futurity or a holds a sense of mutability and like will operate differently in the future. So whether or not they become unstretched, it's like the implication that they can.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for that answer and that knowledge. And now I'm going to go look at her work. There's so much to take away from this lecture today, Ricki. We thank you so much. I know you have a hard stop at the hour, so I want to be conscious of that. So I'd love to end it there. And Laura, would you like to talk? Thank you one more time, Ricki. And Laura, would you like to announce our next speaker in the series?
Yeah, of course. Again, thank you so much, Ricki. I am a little bit too behind to get the slide up, but please join us again on February 19th. It's another Wednesday at 9 a.m. Mountain, so whatever time it was for you for this talk. And it'll be with a collective or a duo called Weaving X Coding. So I always just say weaving and coding in my mind. And I'm really excited to hear from them. So we will post more about that on Instagram and on our website. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you again, Ricki, for sharing with us. I hope it wasn't too uncomfortable, and I'm so thankful that you did.
Thank you, Ricki, and thank you, everybody. Have a great day.
Oh, cool.